There's a secret written on your face that you probably haven't noticed. Not in your wrinkles or lack thereof, not in your skincare routine, but in something far older and more mysterious. The ancient alchemists believed that the soul's condition could literally transform the body, that a person's inner life didn't just influence their appearance, but actively sculpted it from the inside out. And Carl Jung, who spent decades studying the relationship between psyche and matter, discovered something that modern psychology still struggles to explain. Some people carry an inexplicable youthfulness that has nothing to do with genetics, lifestyle, or luck. They seem to exist slightly outside of time, and there's a reason for it that goes deeper than you might imagine. If you've ever been told you look younger than your years, if strangers consistently guess you're a decade less than your actual age, or if you've simply noticed that while your friends seem to be aging rapidly, you somehow aren't, this isn't vanity we're talking about. This is an invitation to understand something profound about your inner world. Because according to Jungian psychology, the face you wear isn't just skin and bone. It's a living autobiography of your relationship with your own depths, and what it reveals might surprise you. Welcome to Deep Psyche Lab, where we explore the hidden architecture of the human psyche. I'm genuinely glad you're here because what we're about to discuss cuts to the heart of one of Jung's most misunderstood insights about the soul's journey through time. If you're new here, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss these explorations into the deeper meanings behind everyday mysteries. Let's begin with something Jung observed throughout his clinical practice that troubled him for years. He noticed that certain patients, regardless of their chronological age, carried what he called a peculiar timelessness in their presence. They moved through the world with an energy that seemed to defy the calendar. But Jung, being Jung, couldn't leave it at surface observation. He needed to understand the underlying psychic mechanism. What he discovered was that these individuals shared something unusual. They maintained an active, dynamic relationship with what he called the self, the central archetype that organizes and integrates the entire personality. But here's where it gets interesting, and where most pop psychology completely misses the point. This wasn't about positive thinking or staying young at heart in some superficial sense. It was about something far more demanding and, honestly, far more dangerous. Jung identified a phenomenon he called the Puer Aeternus, the eternal youth, and this is where we need to be careful because this concept has two faces. On one side, there's the pathological Puer, the person who refuses to grow up, who remains psychologically adolescent, avoiding commitment, responsibility, and the weight of being fully human. This person might look young, but they're essentially frozen, trapped in a kind of Peter Pan syndrome that's ultimately destructive. But on the other side, and this is what Jung found truly fascinating, there's what we might call the integrated Puer, the person who has done the difficult work of growing up, of accepting limitation and mortality, but who somehow maintains access to the spring of eternal renewal within the psyche. These are two completely different phenomena, and understanding the difference is crucial. The person who appears younger than their age in the way we're discussing today isn't avoiding life. They're not running from responsibility or hiding from death. In fact, it's often the opposite. They've encountered their own mortality, stared into their own abyss, done their shadow work, and somehow emerged with something intact that others lose along the way. Jung called this the divine child within, not in a religious sense necessarily, but as a psychological reality, a living center of renewal and creativity that most people unconsciously abandon as they age. When you look at someone who carries this quality, you're not seeing immaturity, you're seeing integration. You're seeing someone who has managed to bring the opposites together, who has married the old king with the young prince, to use alchemical language that Jung loved. Now let's talk about what actually happens in the psyche to create this effect, because this is where depth psychology offers something that no amount of skincare advice ever could. Jung observed that most people, as they move through life, begin to identify almost exclusively with their persona, the mask they wear for the world. The persona is necessary. It's how we function in society, but problems arise when we forget it's a mask. We start to believe we are our roles, our jobs, our social identities. And here's what Jung noticed. The more rigidly a person identifies with their persona, the faster they seem to age. It's as if the psyche itself begins to petrify, to turn to stone. The face becomes a mask in a literal sense. hardened into fixed expressions, defensive postures, permanent frowns, or forced smiles that no longer reach the eyes. But the person who appears younger has maintained what Jung called permeability between consciousness and the unconscious. They haven't sealed themselves off from their own depths. They still dream, and they pay attention to their dreams. They still feel wonder, but not in a naive way, in a way that's been tested and earned. They've learned to hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. They can be serious and playful, responsible and spontaneous, wise and curious. This isn't about balance in some static sense. It's about a dynamic interplay of opposites, a constant dance between structure and chaos, between knowing and not knowing. And this dance, this living relationship with the unconscious, has physiological effects that science is only beginning to understand. There's emerging research in psychoneuroimmunology that suggests our psychological states directly influence gene expression, inflammation levels, cellular repair mechanisms, and even telomere length. But Jung intuited this almost a century ago through pure phenomenological observation. He noticed that repression, denial, and psychic rigidity don't just affect mood. They affect the body itself. When we lock away parts of ourselves, when we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, when we live entirely through the persona and cut ourselves off from the self, something in us begins to die prematurely. The vitality drains away. The light goes out of the eyes. And yes, the face begins to show it in ways that transcend mere wrinkles. Think about people you know who seem to have aged overnight after a divorce, a job loss, or a major life disappointment. What's happening psychologically? Often, it's that their entire identity was invested in something external, and when that collapsed, they had no inner ground to stand on. They were living entirely through the persona, and when the persona shattered, there was nothing underneath. Contrast this with people who've faced similar or worse tragedies but somehow come through with a strange vitality, sometimes looking even more alive than before. Jung would say these people accessed something during their crisis. They touched the self. They made contact with a deeper source of meaning that isn't dependent on external circumstances. And this contact is literally regenerative. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of this. Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the organizing principle that's constantly working to bring us toward wholeness. The self expresses itself through symbols, synchronicities, dreams, and what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability of the psyche to create new attitudes that transcend and include previous limitations. Now, when someone maintains an active relationship with the self, when they're engaged in what Jung called the individuation process, something remarkable happens. They stop aging in the conventional sense because they're no longer moving linearly through time. They're moving spirally, circling back to integrate what was left behind, descending into depths they previously avoided, climbing to new heights of understanding. This is psychological time, and it operates completely differently from chronological time. The person on the individuation path is constantly dying and being reborn. They're not clinging to youth because they're intimately familiar with death, not as an end but as a transformation. Every major life transition, every descent into depression or anxiety, every night of the soul is experienced as a kind of death, and on the other side of it, if they've truly gone through it rather than around it, there's renewal. This is the secret of the alchemical process that Jung studied so obsessively. The old must be dissolved before the new can emerge. But most people avoid the dissolution. They numb, they distract, they harden themselves against change. And in doing so, they stop the regenerative process. They choose a kind of living death, and it shows. Here's something Jung emphasized that often gets overlooked in discussions of his work. The body is not separate from the psyche. He called them two aspects of the same underlying reality. What affects one affects the other. This isn't dualism, it's a profound unity that Western culture has spent centuries trying to deny. So when we talk about appearing younger, we're not talking about some mystical process disconnected from physical reality. We're talking about the psyche's influence on physiological processes, on stress hormones, on the nervous system, on cellular regeneration. A person who has integrated their shadow, who isn't carrying the exhausting burden of repression, who has made peace with their unlived lives, literally has more energy available for living. That energy shows up in their eyes, their skin, their movement, their voice. Jung also spoke about the particular challenge of the second half of life, what he called the afternoon of life. He noticed that many of his patients around 40 or 50 hit a wall. The goals that motivated them in youth, success, family, achievement, suddenly felt hollow. This is the midlife crisis in its true sense. Not a cliché about sports cars, but a genuine spiritual emergency. And Jung observed that those who tried to power through it, who tried to remain youthful by external means, ended up looking and feeling older. But those who accepted the crisis as an invitation, who turned inward and asked the deeper questions, who allowed themselves to be transformed by the encounter with mortality and limitation, these people emerged with a quality that could only be called renewed youth. Not the youth of the first half of life, but something richer, tempered by experience yet somehow fresh. This is where the spiritual dimension comes in, and Jung was always careful to distinguish between spirit and psyche while also recognizing their intimate connection. In many spiritual traditions, the goal is to transcend the body, to rise above materiality. But Jung's approach was different. He believed in incarnation in the deepest sense, bringing spirit into matter, integrating heaven and earth, not escaping the body but fully inhabiting it. The person who appears younger in the way we're discussing hasn't transcended their humanity. They've fully embraced it. They've accepted their animal nature, their sexuality, their aggression, their fear, their mortality. And paradoxically, by accepting these things, by bringing consciousness to what was unconscious, they free up enormous amounts of energy that were previously locked in repression. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. Imagine two people in their 50s. The first person has lived what society considers a successful life, but they've done it by suppressing huge parts of themselves. Maybe they took the safe job instead of the creative path. Maybe they stayed in a marriage that died years ago. Maybe they've spent decades smiling when they're angry, being nice when they're furious, pretending everything is fine when inside they're screaming. All of this takes tremendous psychic energy to maintain. The shadow grows enormous, filled with all the unlived possibilities, all the unacknowledged emotions, all the roads not taken. And that shadow weight shows up in the body, in tension, in illness, in a face that's hardened into a defensive mask. Now imagine a second person, also in their 50s, who made different choices. Not easier choices, often harder ones. They listened to their inner voice even when it cost them. They had the difficult conversations. They left the secure position to try something that actually mattered to them, even though it meant risk and uncertainty. They did their shadow work, which means they acknowledged the parts of themselves they'd rather not see, the jealousy, the rage, the lust, the pettiness. They brought these things into consciousness, not to act them out, but to integrate them, to reclaim the energy locked in them. This person has scars, they've been through things, but somehow they carry a lightness. Their face is open, their eyes are alive. They've earned their youthfulness through descent and return, through what the mystics call dying before you die. Jung would say that the first person is living from the ego, the conscious self that's always trying to control, to present the right image, to avoid failure and pain. The second person has learned to live from the self, to trust the deeper intelligence of the psyche, to flow with what Jung called the individuation process. And here's the crucial point. Living from the self requires constant courage. It means facing the unknown, embracing change, allowing old structures to die so new ones can emerge. It means staying psychologically alive, and that aliveness, that willingness to be transformed, has somatic correlates. The body of someone who's psychologically alive is different from the body of someone who's psychologically defended and shut down. There's also the question of what Jung called participation mystique, the sense of being connected to something larger than the isolated ego. People who appear younger often maintain this capacity for connection, not just to other people, but to nature, to beauty, to mystery. They haven't become cynical and closed off. They've kept their sense of awe intact. But again, this isn't naive innocence. It's sophisticated innocence, innocence on the other side of experience. They've seen the horror, the tragedy, the meaninglessness, and they've chosen meaning anyway. They've stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back, but they didn't flinch. They integrated that darkness, and by doing so, they can now hold light in a way that doesn't deny darkness. Jung also talked about the role of play and imagination in maintaining psychological vitality. Children are constantly imagining, playing, creating. They inhabit multiple realities simultaneously. But most adults abandon this capacity in the name of being realistic, being responsible, being serious, and something vital dies when we stop playing. Not silly play necessarily, though that has its place, but creative play, imaginative engagement with possibility. The person who has maintained access to the creative imagination, who can still be enchanted by an idea, fascinated by a question, captivated by beauty. This person carries youth not as a denial of age, but as a dimension of consciousness that exists outside chronological time. I want to address something important here, because I can already hear some of you thinking that this sounds like blaming people for aging or suggesting that looking old means you've failed psychologically. That's absolutely not what I'm saying, and it's not what Jung was saying. Physical aging is natural, inevitable, and nothing to be ashamed of. We're talking about something more subtle, a quality of presence that some people maintain regardless of their wrinkles or gray hair. You can have a deeply lined face and still carry this youthfulness of spirit. You can have a smooth face and be psychologically ancient, rigid, dead inside. We're not talking about fighting aging. We're talking about remaining psychologically alive throughout the aging process, and that's a completely different endeavor. What's more, different people are called to different paths. Not everyone is meant to maintain this quality. Some people's task in the second half of life is precisely to become the elder, the crone, the wise old one. They're meant to ripen into age, to embody its wisdom and authority. This is equally valid, equally important. Jung's psychology isn't prescriptive. It doesn't say everyone should look young or old. It simply describes the psychic mechanisms at play and allows us to understand what's happening in our own process. The key is consciousness. Are we aging consciously, aware of what's happening psychologically, or are we aging unconsciously, buffeted by forces we don't understand? There's also the shadow side of eternal youth that we need to address honestly. Some people who appear younger are actually avoiding the necessary descent into aging and death. They're clutching at youth out of fear, and this creates its own problems. Jung called this the Puer Aeternus pathology, and it's characterized by an inability to commit, a fear of being trapped, a constant need for novelty and escape. These people might look young, but they're stunted, unable to access the wisdom and depth that come with truly embracing the afternoon of life. They're flying too close to the sun, identified with the spirit principle, afraid to land in the earthy reality of aging bodies and finite lives. This is not what we're talking about when we discuss integrated youthfulness. This is its opposite, a refusal rather than an integration. The integrated person has what Jung called the union of opposites. They're both young and old, playful and serious, ascending and descending, spiritual and earthy. They don't cling to one pole. They can move between them fluidly. And this fluidity, this psychological flexibility is key. Rigidity ages us. Flexibility keeps us vital. Not physical flexibility necessarily, though there's often a correlation, but psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to change, to let go of what's no longer serving us, to embrace what's new even when it's uncomfortable. Let me take you deeper into what Jung meant by the self, because this is really the heart of the matter. The self isn't something you achieve or become. It's already there, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. The ego, the conscious I, is just a small part of the self, floating like an island in the ocean of the unconscious. Most people identify exclusively with the ego, and as they age, the ego becomes increasingly fragile because it's always under threat from the unconscious, from the parts of ourselves we've rejected or never known. But the person on the individuation path learns to establish what Jung called the ego-self axis, a living connection between the conscious personality and the deeper self. And when this connection is alive, when there's dialogue between ego and self, something remarkable happens. The person stops identifying exclusively with their limited, temporal ego. They begin to experience themselves as something larger, something that doesn't age in the usual sense because it exists in psychological time, not just chronological time. This might sound abstract, but it has very concrete effects. When you're identified only with your ego, every change is a threat. Aging is a threat because it means the ego is weakening, losing power, approaching death. But when you've touched the self, when you've experienced that deeper ground of being, aging becomes transformation rather than decline. Each stage of life becomes an opportunity for new realizations, new integrations. You're not trying to preserve the ego identity of your youth. You're allowing the self to express itself through the changing forms of your life. And this attitude, this relationship to change, affects how you age at every level: psychological, emotional, and physical. Jung also believed that we have a kind of inner guide, what he sometimes called the wise old man or wise old woman archetype, depending on gender. This is the part of the psyche that knows the way, that can guide us through life's transitions. But most people don't listen to this inner wisdom. They're too caught up in external demands, social expectations, the ego's constant anxiety about survival and status. The person who appears younger than their age has often learned to listen to this inner voice, to trust its guidance even when it contradicts external wisdom. They've developed what Jung called a relationship to the numinous, to the sacred dimension of existence. And this relationship provides a kind of existential security that isn't dependent on youth, beauty, success, or any other temporal condition. Here's where we come to the practical implications of all this. If you're someone who appears younger than your age, what does Jungian psychology suggest this means about you? First, it likely means you've maintained psychological permeability. You haven't rigidly identified with any single role or identity. Second, it suggests you've done at least some shadow work. You've faced and integrated parts of yourself that others might deny. Third, it indicates an active relationship with the creative imagination. You're still capable of wonder, play, transformation. Fourth, it points to a degree of individuation, a movement toward wholeness rather than one-sidedness. And fifth, it suggests you've touched something transpersonal, something beyond the ego, that provides a source of renewal not dependent on external circumstances. But with this gift comes responsibility. Jung believed that if you've been given certain capacities, you have an obligation to use them consciously, not for ego inflation, but in service of something larger. If you carry this quality of youthfulness, it's not for you to hoard or to use to feel superior. It's a kind of medicine that the collective needs, a reminder that another way of aging is possible, that we don't have to submit to the death in life that our culture often presents as inevitable. Your task is to embody this possibility consciously, to understand it deeply enough that you can help others access it in their own way. Now, I want to address those of you who might be thinking, but I don't appear younger than my age. Does this mean something is wrong with me psychologically? Absolutely not. As I mentioned earlier, different people are on different paths. Some are meant to ripen into visible age, to become the elder whose face shows the roads traveled, the wisdom earned. What matters isn't the external appearance, but the internal relationship to your own process. Are you aging consciously? Are you facing the psychological challenges of each life stage?
Are you doing your shadow work?
Are you listening to your dreams? Are you allowing old forms to die so new ones can be born? These are the questions that matter, not whether strangers guess your age correctly. There's also a cultural dimension we need to acknowledge. Our society is pathologically youth-obsessed, and this obsession is itself a symptom of collective shadow denial. We're terrified of aging because we're terrified of death, and we're terrified of death because we've lost touch with the transpersonal dimension of existence, with anything larger than the ego. In healthier cultures, aging is honored as a necessary stage of life. Elders are respected for their wisdom. Death is integrated into the community's understanding rather than hidden away. In our culture, we try to fight aging at every turn, and this fight itself accelerates the process because it creates internal conflict. And internal conflict is exhausting and aging. The Jungian approach offers a third way between obsessive youth preservation and passive resignation to decline. It's a path of conscious engagement with the aging process, understanding it as a psychological journey with its own tasks and gifts. From this perspective, appearing younger becomes less about preserving youth and more about maintaining vitality through transformation. You're not trying to stop the clock. You're learning to live in a different kind of time, psychological time, where development isn't linear but spiral, where endings are also beginnings, where death and rebirth happen continuously. Jung himself aged in a fascinating way. If you look at photos of him throughout his life, there's something timeless about his presence, even as he visibly grew older. His face became more lined, his hair white, but his eyes remained alive, curious, penetrating. He embodied what he taught, living into old age with full consciousness, engaging with new ideas until the end, never rigidifying into fixed positions. He faced his own mortality directly, writing some of his most profound work in his final years. He showed that you can age fully, accepting all that aging brings, while maintaining the psychological vitality we're discussing. This is the integration we're pointing toward. Before we close, I want to offer one final thought that Jung emphasized throughout his work. The goal isn't perfection. It's not about becoming some ideal person who never ages or who ages perfectly. It's about becoming who you actually are, which includes all your flaws, limitations, wounds, and yes, your aging body. The paradox is that by fully accepting your humanity, including your mortality, you touch something in yourself that doesn't die, that exists outside of time. This is the self in Jung's sense, not the ego that's born and dies, but the organizing principle that was there before you were born and will be there after you die. When you make contact with that, when you live from that place even partially, the question of whether you appear younger or older becomes less important. What matters is that you're alive, really alive, conscious, engaged, Psyche transforming. This channel is educational and not a substitute for therapy or medical advice. If this exploration resonated with you, if it opened something up or helped you understand your own experience in a new way, please let me know by commenting "I am timeless" below. I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your reflections on this. If you found value in this deep dive into Jungian psychology, please hit the like button. It helps more people discover these ideas. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Deep Psyche Lab and turn on notifications so you don't miss future explorations into the hidden dimensions of psychological life. We're building a community of people committed to depth, to truth, to the hard work of becoming conscious, and I'm grateful you're part of it. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of youthfulness, aging, and the mysterious relationship between psyche and soma. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking the difficult questions, and keep trusting the wisdom of your own unfolding process. This is Deep Psyche Lab, where we honor the complexity of being human.